Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. I hope everyone has been having a great day so far, and thank you so much for taking the time to hop on to our webinar today. We're just going to go ahead and get started, and as folks trickle in, they can just jump in wherever we're at. So thank you so much for taking the time again, and we are really excited for today's webinar on lead pipes, talking about lead in drinking water and what's going on at the state, federal, and local level and what we can all do about it. So next slide, please.
All right, give me just a moment.
All good. And while we are sorting out the PowerPoint, I can go ahead and start talking about what the next slide is going to be, which is just an agenda for our conversation today. So we're going to start off with opening up the space that I'm doing right now and introductions of our speakers today, go over some Zoom housekeeping, and then we'll go on to talk about lead, its dangers in drinking water, and how lead pipes are the key contributor to lead in drinking water, what's going on at the local, state, and federal level on this issue of lead pipes and lead in drinking water. Then we'll hear from some folks in Buffalo and Newburgh about their experiences with lead contaminated water. We'll also recap and have a little bit of a Q&A recapping the lead poisoning hearing that happened a couple weeks ago, held by the Senate and Health committees. And a lot of folks, amazing advocates and activists, testified at this hearing, and we're looking forward to see what comes from it. So we'll communicate a bit of those top line takeaways today. And then we'll do an interactive dream building activity, really reflecting on and having dialogue on what a lead-free New York means, what it looks like, and what we can do to achieve a lead-free New York. And then we'll close out our webinar tonight. So with that, we'll transition to introductions really quickly. My name is Dharma Santos. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Clean Water Associate with Environmental Advocates NY. And if we move on to the next slide, it'll have a list of all of our speakers. And I will turn it over to Rob to introduce himself.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am Rob Hayes, the Director of Clean Water with Environmental Advocates NY. So I work really closely with Dharma on our clean water team. Really excited for this event tonight. Thanks again for joining. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joan from NRDC.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Let me just switch to my notes for a moment. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here and to have been asked to speak at this event. Thank you to Environmental Advocates of New York for organizing this forum. And Dharma, thank you for organizing us all and for putting the slides together. I will tee up the issue by talking about lead exposure from water and the lead pipes that deliver drinking water to homes. There are other pathways of exposure that are of concern, of course, such as lead dust and lead paint chips, but in today's forum, we're focusing on the drinking water pathway. And of all the sources or pathways for lead poisoning, drinking water represents 20%. It rises to 40 to 60% for infants that drink mixed formula, when the infant formula is mixed with household drinking water. So 20% and then 40 to 60% are very large percentages. And we know what the problem is and how to fix it. So we absolutely need to get to work to fix this problem. Now the health, slide 5, please. The health experts agree that there is no safe level of lead. Children and fetuses are the most vulnerable. Even very low levels of lead can bring a lifetime of problems. If children are lead poisoned, the effects can be severe and irreversible. So what are some of those effects? Well, the slide tells you what the main ones are. Lead harms children's brain development and can result in a lower IQ, an inability to focus in school, aggressive behavior, which can lead to criminal behavior and incarceration, increased rates of teenage pregnancy, It can affect the nervous system and kidneys. It decreases bone and muscle growth. And extreme cases are treated by something called chelation, which is very painful for children and distressing for parents, to say the least. Next slide, please. So how does lead get into our drinking water? Basically it's from a lead pipe that comes to a home, which is also called a lead service line. That's the pipe that runs from the water main located in the street to a residence's water meter. Lead pipes are small, these lead service lines. We think of them as a straw among other larger pipes that also can deliver water, but not to the smaller homes. These lead service lines, these lead pipes, are found in smaller, older homes. Some of these homes are used as daycare centers. Very alarming. They are not used in larger buildings like apartment buildings, because those buildings need a larger pipe to serve that population in an apartment building, which would not be made of lead. Lead can also be found in solder and brass fixtures. Lead levels can be greater if the water is corrosive. That's what happened in Flint, Michigan. The city switched to a more corrosive water source to save money, and it poisoned a generation of children. And when water is corrosive, the leaking and flaking of lead into the drinking water of a household tap is sped up. Now, the communities that are affected tend to be communities that have older housing stock and where low-income people and people of color live. This is a big environmental justice issue. So what's the holdup in getting these pipes removed? Primarily two, and we can all identify more. But EPA's failure to set a robust lead and copper rule that would be truly health protective. Now, EPA's lead and copper rule was always complex and riddled with loopholes, and even more with the changes that the immediate prior administration made to the rule. But stay tuned, because this week, EPA will announce its plans for revamping the awful lead and copper rule from the prior administration. We don't know what it's going to say or look like just yet, but we're anxious to see what EPA will say later this week. And another issue what's holding up getting these pipes removed has always been money, but that's also changing. And Suzanne Novak from Earth Justice will go into that a little bit more. There's funding under the New York State Clean Water Infrastructure Act, the federal bipartisan infrastructure law that just passed last month. And we might get some more on the Build Back Better legislation. The goal is to have this work be done at no cost to residents. So how many lead service lines are there in New York State? And Suzanne will go in this in more detail, but NRDC issued a report earlier this year, which estimates there are at least 360,000 lead service lines in New York State, but the number could be higher. That number puts New York State in the top 4 states with the most lead service lines. And Suzanne will address the problem is that we don't have a solid, reliable inventory of lead service lines. And that's a national problem, not just in New York State. So finally, how can you determine if you have a lead service line? You can check with your water utility. You can check with your neighbors, because they may also have been looking into this. You can perform something called a scratch test. And if you do the Google, you can figure out how to do that simple test. I think this is a good place for me to stop and turn it over to Josh Kleinberg from New York LCV to address what's happening more specifically in New York City and Troy.
Great, thank you so much, Joan, for that. Josh Kleinberg from New York League of Conservation Voters. Among the things that Joan had mentioned, one of the challenges that we face here in the state is knowing where the lead service lines are. You know, the old saying, you can't manage what you can't measure, knowledge is power. There's any number of these sayings. But really, you know, until we get a very clear sense as to where these lead service lines are located, how many there are, how they're distributed, et cetera, you know, it's hard to really come up with a coherent game plan. But I wanted to share with you some things that are happening locally that are giving us some hope that you know, we might be able to get to this issue sooner than later, if we don't have a statewide inventory yet, at least what's happening at the local level. So in New York City, and here's a map here of New York City that that shows the distribution, if you will, of the potential lead service lines. This is a neat story because it was a couple of years ago when local advocates at the New York City level got together with the city council, who was interested in pursuing all sorts of bills to really up its game in terms of lead poisoning protection and prevention. And there was a great bill passed, Introduction 709, sponsored by a great council member, Jimmy Van Bramer from Queens. Very simple, just requiring the Department of Environmental Protection, which is the water provider for the city of New York, to put on their website an interactive map with information regarding what they know about the lead service lines, like what's known, what's unknown, what's not lead for sure, so that we can really start to get a sense of what's out there. This dashboard here that you're looking at now, we actually, New York LCV, we took that underlying data and we're able to visualize it, adding a heat map component and then having a dashboard there, which is really a good starting off point for the city of New York, really having a good sense as to what is out there. This is clickable and searchable. It's something we're going to share with the incoming mayor and the incoming council, but it's a really great way to start that conversation of, now that we know that the data is out there, now that we have a good sense as to what might be out there, and there's money might be coming that will be addressed by Suzanne. What are we going to do about it? Because there's a shortcoming in this legislation. The shortcoming here is that the city will only, at this point, which is historical, take responsibility for what it owns in terms of lead service lines, and they have to replace them all by December 31 of 2025. Well, that's only 2%. 2% of 137,000 ain't a lot, and the other 98% really needs to be addressed. And that's something we're going to be talking to the council about. So there's a great start in New York City. We have a good handle on the data. As this information comes in and we learn more about these unknown service lines, which does represent a very large number here, and we determine whether or not they're potential lead or not lead, we'll be able to really work with the city. Now, in terms of discovering what's unknown, I just wanted to point to, and if you can move to the next slide, a really neat program that's happening to the north of New York City, in the city of Troy. And this is really terrific. It's innovative, and it might very well be a model for other cities as well, and maybe even New York City, to really help with the unknowns, if you will. They're doing some citizen science here. They're reaching out to the residents to help them to fill in gaps of knowledge. And it's very simple, and you see the pictures on the right there that they have on their website. If it's hard to see, I can just explain to you. They're just encouraging residents, go to your basement, go to where the source of your drinking water is coming into your home, and check out that pipe, and scratch it if you can. And it might be one of three things. If it's if it scratches and it looks orangey, well, that's copper, and if it scratches and it's flaky, well, that's lead. And if you can put a magnet on it, then it's going to be galvanized steel, and it's one of those. Unless you have a really old home and it's wood, but chances are it's one of those three metals. And then they're putting on a platform by which you can then go online and then report it to the city. So it's really neat. We're going to be taking a close look at this because, again, as localities really start to get their act together, and they will need to per law, and just because the state is going to be requiring it of them in a few years, they're going to know immediately what they know. They're going to know what they don't know. And then for what they don't know, there's going to have to be some citizen science work, we believe, to help fill in those gaps. So I'll stop there, but I definitely wanted to share some of this information of things that we're looking at as advocates as this situation evolves at the local level, which will hopefully permeate to the state and the federal consciousness. So I'd love to hand it over to my colleague, Suzanne Novak.
Thank you, Josh. Next slide, please. Thanks. I'm Suzanne Novak. I'm a senior attorney in the Northeast Office of Earth Justice, and I'm working on some advocacy about lead in drinking water in New York, but also very heavily on the federal level with several people on this call. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in New York State and on the federal level. So as Joan mentioned earlier, there's an estimated 360,000 lead pipes throughout New York State. There have been recent EPA lead action level exceedances in Amsterdam, Herkimer, and Newburgh. And I just want to make clear what that means. The lead and copper rule, the federal lead and copper rule, is quite complicated, but actions only need to be taken when an average, a certain percentage of samples exceed what's known as a lead action level. The lead action level is 15 parts per billion, but as Joan explained earlier, there's no safe level of lead. So action only needs to be taken and start replacing lead service lines when you hit the 15 parts per billion, even though 1 part per billion is dangerous. And so currently, although there are so many lead service lines around the state and around the country, we don't know where they are. And in New York, it's only in New York City, Rochester, and Syracuse. They're the only cities with publicly available lead pipe inventories. What the federal lead and copper rule it never had a provision in there requiring inventories, but going forward it will. So that's a big plus going forward. New York State has a lead service line replacement program, and $30 million was allocated for it. And in some respects, it's a really great program because their replacements and the costs don't fall on the homeowners. However, it has been really slow in getting this funding out to different communities. A lot of the money hasn't been spent yet. And of course, $30 million won't come close to covering replacing all the lead service lines in New York. So you can see at the bottom of the slide, just different examples of the estimated number of lead service lines in different cities, with Buffalo, a very high number of 40,000 lead service lines. Next slide, please. So at the national level, some good things are happening. We hope more. So the recent bipartisan infrastructure deal that was just passed had $15 billion in it for lead service line replacement that will go through the state revolving funds. This will be a mixture of grants and loans. And so that's great. This is a large amount. Everyone's excited about it, except the estimate is that it will take 45 to 60 billion to replace all of the nation's lead service lines, which are about between 10 and 12 million. So we are hoping that the bill that's coming up, the reconciliation bill, otherwise known as the Build Back Better bill, will have significantly more money in it to go to lead service lines. But even if the money is not allocated, we think it's important for the protection of health for everybody that we get all these lead pipes out of the ground. And once the money comes into the state, it goes through the state revolving funds. And then it will be very important to figure out how and whether this money is getting to the communities most in need. And so we're going to want to do some advocacy around that and all gather and figure out how we make sure that that happens in New York State. Next slide, please. So at the national level, which I referred to and Joan referred to somewhat, there is the federal lead and copper rule. It's been on the books since 1991. There had been no major changes to the rule for 30 years until the end of the Trump administration. It has been a very ineffective rule, and EPA had been working on it for a long time. And at the end of the Trump administration, they put out a rule, and there were some positive aspects in it, as I mentioned before, for the first time requiring lead service line inventories. But in several respects, the bill took major steps backwards. And one of those steps backwards was slowing down the rate at which lead service lines need to be replaced once there was a lead action level exceedance. The rule did close some loopholes about what counted as a lead service line replacement, but they slowed down the annual rate from 7% to 3%, which was a big drop back. And so then we and NRDC, on behalf of several groups, we sued about this regression. Then the Biden administration came in, they put the rule on hold. And many of us advocates around the country have been advocating really strongly to get EPA to strengthen this rule and not only reverse the rollbacks in it, but take proactive measures, and that regardless of funding, to require all lead service lines to be replaced within a 10-year period of time. So I think, as Joan mentioned, on December 16th, just a few days from now, we are expecting to hear from EPA to let us know if they're letting the Trump rule go into effect or if they're revising it. We don't expect them to give us all the details on December 16th, but we're hoping that they'll at least say that they are going to be strengthening it. And we'll look for that, and if it's great, we'll be excited. And if it's good, we'll be kind of excited. And if it's good or bad, we'll be doing a lot of advocacy and maybe some litigation to make sure that it's protected. So now I'm going to turn this over to Rob Hayes, who's going to tell you a little more about the legislative hearing that happened recently. And take it away, Rob.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Thanks, Suzanne. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a hearing that the New York State Legislature held. The Senate Health and Housing committees came together. A bunch of legislators came up on a panel, and they listened to testimony from advocates from all across New York State about the lead poisoning crisis. And there were a couple big takeaways, I think, from that hearing that just happened. I think one of the biggest is that this was the first hearing on the lead poisoning crisis that New York State had held since 1994, almost 30 years ago now. But what's kind of shocking is that in those last 30 years, not a whole lot has been done to address the lead poisoning crisis, to address the fact that there are hundreds and thousands of lead pipes buried underground, still delivering drinking water to people all over New York State. It was really shocking, I think, that New York continues to lead the nation on percentage of kids that have elevated blood lead levels and that are lead poisoned. And that is, Joan and Suzanne were mentioning, we continue to lead the nation in terms of the number of lead pipes that are buried, underground in our cities. So one of the big takeaways from the hearing was that this remains an enormous, enormous problem in New York State. And one of the other big takeaways was that this is a statewide problem. It's not located in one city here or one city there. Almost every city in New York, older industrialized cities, have lead pipes and lead paint and all these other sources of lead exposure. And you saw that represented in the panel of legislators that was present, from Buffalo to Syracuse to down on Long Island. It's a statewide problem, and it's going to need a statewide solution. And the statewide solution in terms of the lead in drinking water side of things is really just to replace 100% of the lead pipes in New York State. The only way that we're going to eliminate lead exposure is to remove the source of contamination entirely. And of course, that's going to cost money to do. It's going to cost money to get work crews out on the street and dig up these pipes, replace them with different materials. But what's really important to note is that over the long run, doing these lead pipe replacements, getting the lead out of drinking water, is so cost effective. The benefits far outweigh any upfront costs that we'll be putting up there. And there's a great study that I think is mentioned on the slide of the PowerPoint, that every dollar that we spend on lead pipe replacement is going to give us $10 in health and economic benefits in the long term. We're going to create thousands of really good paying, oftentimes union jobs with this funding. And that's going to go a long way to revitalizing local communities, keeping dollars flowing in the communities that need it most. We know there are a lot of challenges ahead. I think, as a lot of the previous speakers mentioned, around identifying where these pipes are, making sure that we're prioritizing the communities most harmed by the lead poisoning crisis when we're starting to do replacements. But it is absolutely achievable, and we just need the political will to do it. So with that, I think that kind of wraps up our kind of initial presentations about what's going on with lead pipes at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. Before I turn it over to our phenomenal community speakers from Buffalo and Newburgh to share their experiences of lead poisoning in their community and their lives, I want to open it up to any questions that you all in the audience have. I know we presented quite a bit of information in a very short time, and happy to answer any questions right off the bat. that any of you might have. And the first question I actually just see in the chat right now is there a transcript of this available? I don't know if there'll be a transcript, but we are recording this webinar and it will be sent out to all the participants afterwards. So you'll definitely have a copy, can go back and see any of this information again after the event's concluded tonight. But maybe what we can do for Q&A now is to either have folks kind of put in the chat that they'd like to ask a question or raise their hand, though I suppose I can't see people with their hands raised right now. But happy to do it either way. And Natalie, I see a thumbs up from you. So if you have a question, you can feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask it.
I'm sorry, I was just reacting to Dharma's note that you could also send the PowerPoint. That was just a thank you.
Oh,
I wasn't asking a question, sorry.
No problem, thanks.
Hello, Rob. I don't have my video on. My name is Gloria Russo and I live in Albany. I'd like to find out the amount of funds that are hopefully going to be available to replace lead service lines. Is the legislation looking at providing enough money to pay for it completely, or is some of the burden of the cost going to be put on the homeowner?
That is a fantastic question, Gloria. And I can start answering that in a number of ways. The funding that New York State has so far made available for lead pipe replacements, that I think $30 million that Suzanne was mentioning earlier. Fortunately, that funding covers the entire cost of the replacement. So homeowners won't bear any of that cost, which is fantastic. That's how it should work every single time with every replacement. It remains to be seen how New York is going to implement the money that it receives from the federal government. We hope and will be advocating that they'll be using, I believe it's about $115 million that we'll be getting from the federal government just next year in 2022. And we hope and will be advocating to make sure that that funding covers the full cost of replacement so that homeowners aren't on the hook for potentially thousands of dollars as these pipe replacements go forward. But it's still kind of an open question at this point, and it'll require, I think, a lot of kind of advocacy and community voices speaking up to make sure that our state lawmakers and state decision makers know that this is really a problem that has to be solved kind of from a government-wide approach, and that homeowners can't afford to take on those costs.
Okay, Rob, I'm trying to clarify, I guess, a technical issue with all of this. Turns out I found out just a couple of months ago, I have a lead service line, much to my dismay. And I did it the way that the city said, and I had the DOH send me the bottles, took a few weeks, had the testing done. It was high, very high. I then was alarmed and I decided, let me do it again. Let me do it after the Brita filter, because I've always used a Brita filter. So I paid for it myself out of pocket and had 3 samples done. First flush, and let it go for a while, or first draw, then a flush, and then after the Brita filter. It's still there, well over the 15 parts per billion. The Brita filter dropped it down a little bit, but not that much. So that was my Brita filter. That's the regular Brita filter that I use. So I've been in touch with the city's water department, and they told me that what they have is they have a Brita filter that they got when they had an RFP to get these filters, for their citizens. That is a long-lasting Brita filter that will remove the lead. So I went over to the city water department and I picked that up a couple of weeks ago. They also told me they can give you $2,000 as a grant, but first you get the work done and then you can get the money back, but you have to go through their forms and all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. I've had one estimate, not a written estimate, because unfortunately in mid-September, my sewer line broke and they thought it was just a clog at the trap, and it wasn't. The whole thing was at a 45-degree angle to get down to the deep main, and it broke there and broke off completely. And I had to have the whole thing dug up. It's 10 feet deep. And that's how we found the lead service line. So I had all that done and replaced. I couldn't do it right away then because the company who was doing the work was not available to spend the extra 2 days to do all that for me because their schedule was so tight. And it took me 5 days to get the building permit or excavating permit from the city to even get the sewer repaired. That was a 12-day wait with no sewer. So needless to say, I'm a little anxious about trying to get my lead service line replaced, but they're not paying for the whole thing. So I have to front the money and then I can get it back with their grant. So this program you're talking about next year, when that becomes enacted and that money becomes available with the Build Back Better Act, and my understanding this correctly, supposedly it should give the money to the states to pay in full for each homeowner to replace their lead service line. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Gotcha. That would be the hope, what you're just describing. So, and there are maybe a couple things to mention there. I think first is that the federal government will give the money to the state of New York. I think it should be about $115 million just for next year. What will likely then happen is that local governments, water utilities, they'll apply to access that funding from the state. Mm-hmm. So hopefully Albany will apply to access the funding, though we don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. But if Albany applies, if they get money through these federal dollars that have been made available, then hopefully all of that money will be used to kind of fully offset the cost of replacement, and that homeowners wouldn't be on the hook for any of those costs. So honestly, there's still a lot of questions up in the air with all this. And Joan just put in the chat a great comment that Mayor Kathy Sheehan has been really good on this issue. And maybe Joan, happy to turn it over to you in case you know any more on the local situation.
Oh, I've been in, another event with the mayor, and she knows her stuff. She knows what a gooseneck is, what a pigtail is. She's been on site when a lead service line has been replaced. She knows that it's taking too long to get this work done. She is desperate to get these federal dollars and hopes that the state will have a, good rollout for the municipalities. So there's hope.
Thank you, Joan. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Rob.
And thanks for that question, Gloria.
And Rob, I just wanted to add one quick thing. Gloria, the steps that you described that you took were just classic and textbook correct. You had a suspicion, you requested the sample, you got the sample back, you went to the city, you got the filter. I mean, you're what you're doing is exactly what a lot of people are going to have to do, sadly and unfortunately. But it seems like you are definitely on the right track. I'm glad you're able to be here tonight and to answer those questions, because your questions are exactly what fuels us advocates in terms of the work that we're doing to make sure that people that are going through that journey that you're going through to protect yourselves have ultimately that permanent protection and the funding to make you whole.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it.
I have a question. This is Roxana Johnston. I work for the city of Ithaca. Definitely the sort of highest priority cost is for the homeowners and covering that. The second, and shouldn't be forgotten, is that not all the services will actually be on private property. And so it will be the cost to the municipality. And these are costs that have not been budgeted for. The estimates coming out of Rochester with some studies they're doing are $7,000 per replacement. So that's a large capital project over a number of years. Do you know if the funding that's being sought at the federal level is looking to help municipalities offset that? Because ultimately that's taxpayer dollars. And comes out of the pockets of the residents, just like the individual homeowner. Well, not quite just like, but it's an impact. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off the answer to that. The federal funding should be able to be used for any lead service line replacement, whether the service line is privately owned or publicly owned. That's my understanding. So it shouldn't matter if you're in a city where the lines are publicly owned, so long as your city applies to get that funding, they can get hopefully the money they need to start those replacements. Happy to turn it over to some of my other colleagues in case there are any other details to mention on that.
Some of the details, we're hoping that there'll be a lot more money allocated, and some of the details will still need to be worked out. In addition, we're hoping to see there's two different tracks of what's going on the federal level, because there's the money, and then there's also what's going to come down in the lead and copper rule. And there might be mandates about what you can or cannot pass on to the consumer and how much and all that. So there are two things going on parallel tracks. We hope there'll be better regulation, and we hope there'll be more money.
And the only thing I would add to that, and thanks Roxanne for being here tonight. And if the city of Ithaca is the water provider for the residents and it has this inventory of service lines and it could put it out there, that would be really helpful. And if it doesn't, getting it together quick would be helpful, because while all these things are being sorted out in terms of money flowing to New York figuring out what it wants to do, the sooner cities and water providers can really get a handle and get out the word as to what they believe is the problem, the further ahead we'll all be in terms of being able to access what comes down the line. And so that's just the other point we're always just trying to reinforce. We're trying to figure out what's going to happen with the money and how it's going to be distributed, but it's also equally important for us to get organized and to know what is out there so that we can do it quickly and wisely.
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond to that. Yeah, we've been tracking the law when it was headed out, and then it went back, I guess, for revisions. And thank you for kind of saying what some of those might be. Yeah, we've been working on our inventory, and we're going to start planning now for staffing up and education and outreach to let people know what's coming, how things are going to look different and what to expect in the future, and working with them to try and get ahead of actually when the rule is in place for compliance, and trying to get started earlier. So yeah, we will probably have all that out earlier for our residents.
Great. Well, thanks again for your question, Roxana. Anyone else before we shift to some of our community stories? All right. Wonderful. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Anderson from Buffalo, New York.
Thank you, Rob. I was just sitting here thinking pipes, people, and property, and a whole lot more is in this scenario. Let me just tell you, you mentioned 1994. 1994 is when I first entered into concerns around the lead problem here in Buffalo, New York. But I'm going to start at 2017, because in 2017 alone, about 700 children tested positive for lead poisoning in Erie County. The majority of these children were located in Buffalo's low-income neighborhoods, which are predominantly Black and brown communities. And according to the Center for Government Research, children who live in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods in Buffalo are 12 times more likely than children in mostly white neighborhoods to have an elevated blood lead level. In a 2017 national Rutgers, in a national report, Rutgers found Buffalo to be among the most dangerous lead hotspots in America. In Buffalo neighborhoods most impacted by lead contamination, children tested positive for lead poisoning at rates 8 times higher than children in Flint, Michigan during the height of their water crisis. Yet, despite these facts that should have spurred immediate and intense intervention by our state government to address a generational assault on Black and brown family, there's been no meaningful investment or action to protect the children in Buffalo or other cities in the same situation. You mentioned pipes. In Buffalo, Buffalo is one of those cities that don't have a count on how many lead pipes it has. And if we got children who are already contaminated with lead, It's not just from paint. You can be sure it's from many of the housing stock with old pipes in it. I have worked in my community in an attempt to fight this crisis at local level with coalition partners. I've fought for funding to remove lead from homes, educate parents on the risks they face, and provide treatment services for families with lead poisoning children. However, this approach does not work. In Buffalo, we continuously face challenges seeing funds that are supposed to be used to address these issues actually make their way into the hands of those who need it. It is extremely difficult to get answers as to how much money there is, where it's going, and what the exact steps and timelines are to ensure that Buffalo is moving towards becoming a lead-free city. The fact is that Buffalo has dealt with this crisis far too long. And far too many families have suffered across generations with very little progress having been made. Placing the burdens on localities to plan, implement, and fund the solution to the crisis doesn't work. And it is the responsibility of the state to solve this crisis once and for all. And state policy needs to require that every rental house and unit be tested unless the owner can prove that it has already been tested and it is lead-free. And the state should provide funds to help these homeowners. We cannot continue to have a system where children are testing strips for lead contamination. The state too needs to ensure that, that these inspections are stepped up, and they need to take control whenever there's a failure to get the inspections done. The city of Buffalo has been challenged for a long time. I already mentioned since 1994, and that was based on the knowledge that lead is a problem. And as we talk about the problem with pipes and the cost of property, we certainly can't leave out people. And as we see, a lot of folks got skin in the game. And where do we start? We need money that address all these issues. And I believe the state must take the lead in this. The state cannot advocate its positioning on that. Too many children of color and children in poverty don't start their lives with health problems that ensure they don't start their lives fair. And they shouldn't start their lives with health problems and ensure that they never will even have a chance to reach their potential. So in Buffalo, we rise with great concern and in the fight to get what is needed from the federal government and the state government that can address all these issues, from the pipes to the people to the property. I'll stop there in the interest of time, and I'll give it over to Gabrielle.
I was enjoying hearing you speak, and certainly we know that if not now, when, if not us, who? So this is definitely one of those urgent calls. And as I was listening to my friend before me, my daughter was born in '97. So you started this before she was born. And it was in the year, I think 99 or early 2000, when she was diagnosed with lead poison of 42, which was near fatal. I believe fatal is 45, which really irreversible and serious brain damage. But I recall that day as if it was yesterday. Going back to the workforce, I had searched around for various daycares to care for my child when I did return to work. And there was one daycare center I was very ecstatic about. I was happy the hours were right. I knew some of the folks that were there, so it was good. And the lady requested a blood lead test, which I'd never heard of before, but okay. So we went to the pediatrician, had the test, didn't think much about it. My daughter wasn't coughing, sneezing. She didn't seem sick or anything. But a few days later, I received a call from my local Department of Health telling me to take my daughter to our local hospital right away. Like right away. And I was like, well, I got to get right away. And if you can't get there right away, we will send a police escort to your home to make sure you get to the hospital ASAP. And so, of course, I'm confused, shocked, worried, scared. So I scooped up my 2-year-old baby and proceeded to take her to the hospital. And they immediately admitted her and explained to me that she would need to be hooked up to an IV. They were going to start a treatment called chelation. What's that? We'll explain it to you. So it was very nerve-wracking. And for 7 days, my little 2-year-old baby girl was hooked to an IV through her arm. For whatever reason, they couldn't get the blood at the IV in her arm. So it was in her right hand. And we still see the little dot on her right hand. And she's 24 years old today. So that process was very, very difficult, uncertain, because as it has been noted, we don't know the full extent of the aftermath of lead poison. There's, we know that could be some brain damage. There could be just some other things, but it's still up in the air. My daughter developed cysts in different parts of her body when that was not in our family before. Could it be a result of her lead contamination? Could be. I noticed that she's very short. Like, she's a sweet girl. She's very quiet, but she's very short and quick to jump from A to Z. Could that be a result of the contamination? We don't know. My daughter, Alicia, who I brought with me to the state Senate, because if you're talking about children, I thought it was important to have a child in the room. Come here, Lily. And it was her first trip to the Senate, and I'm not trying to put her on display, but we really need to see this. A child. She's innocent. She wakes up every day thinking that she's going to be cared for. And yet, as her grandmother, I could be poisoning her without even knowing it, so it's constantly having our soil tested. Like, it's a lot. But one of the things was that I found interesting was that the lead contamination can also cause deformity. And my granddaughter was born without a left hand. We looked at both sides of the family, and we can't find deformity anywhere. Could that be a result to the lead? But here we are today, right? December 13th. And I'm thinking, what can families do? Because this allocation of money is going to take some time. Also, who gets it, the RFPs, which union or job is going to be chosen to do the work. That's going to take some time. How are they going to map it out? In my small 3.4 square miles of a city, what streets go first? So how is that going to be determined? So there are a lot of steps before we get there. And I'm wondering, what can families do now to protect themselves? And there was a caller on, Gloria Russo, who mentioned she had a Brita filter, which most people bought. And now I hear that that's not necessarily the right way to go. I was interested to find out the result when she said I believe the city was offering one. And I wanted to know, when she used the one the city gave her, was there a difference? Was there an improvement? Was there less lead coming through? And again, any amount of lead is dangerous. So one thing is, I'm thinking, how in my city where there's 70% renters, so you're not even the homeowner, so you have to depend on your landlord to do some of the paperwork. And sometimes landlords can feel some type of way when you're calling about inspecting the home. It becomes us versus them. And it's like, no, I'm not calling on you. I'm calling to, for the health of my family and the families that may live in this apartment after I leave. So, but that dynamic gets very hostile at times because it's like, oh, you're telling on me. No, I'm not telling on you. I'm trying to stay alive. And I hope others to do the same. So, and then people are so bogged down with work and so many things. And now we have COVID. So just thinking of, what families can do now to protect themselves, and how our local water department can get the message out. I know it's out. I'm just not sure if that message is loud enough. And tonight was a city council meeting that I was just going to remind people to have their water tested, but I can do that at another time. And then when you talk about the financial and the economic boost, well, that's true, but I was envisioning my city, who complains that our young men don't have anything to do, there's no work, how we can begin to get them lead removal certified now, so that these same young men who probably have been poisoned by that lead can at least benefit from some of the money of the lead removal. So I'm listening to all of the facts and all of the data, which I truly, truly appreciate everyone on this panel. Dharma and Rob putting this together. I'm really humbled to be here, and just thinking of ways of what I can take from this gathering back to either my local government, my water department, and my fellow residents, on what we can do in the meantime to protect ourselves, protect our children, so we are not continuing to silently be harmed by a contaminant in which we had nothing to do with. And I agree, the state and the federal government is 100% responsible for the eradication of this. And if not now, when? Because my granddaughter Alicia is 5, and my friend that went before me, he's been doing this a long time, and it would really be sad that if 20 years from now we're right back on this call again. So I appreciate everyone, and I hope I haven't gone over time, but I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for sharing your story and your experience navigating the dangers of lead in the home and all these different points of exposure and that really real impact that has had on your family. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And appreciate everyone else on the call holding space for that storytelling as well. And thank you for Jim for sharing that perspective on lead pipes in Buffalo as well. And so with that, we'll transition to a sort of dream building exercise to really evoke conversation, dialogue, and action on what a lead-free New York looks like and what we can do to make that happen. And initially, we were just going to do like breakout rooms with different people, facilitating a series of questions for folks to reflect on and discuss. But since there's about 20 participants, I think it might be best, and for the sake of time as well, if we just have the conversation as one big group. So with that, if we want to move on to the next slide, I can talk briefly and walk through the purpose and the instructions, which are low-key not as relevant anymore now that we're not doing a breakout room, but that's okay. But again, we're just trying to gather narratives and perspectives that we can all use to imagine a world with clean drinking water for all. That's the goal, and we're slowly but surely getting there. And what can we do to accelerate that work? And I will ask for someone to be a note taker, to write down key themes and what folks are saying. And then we can consolidate, translate, and submit that to the Senate Health and Housing Committees as written testimony for the lead hearing that they had the other day. They have a written comment period of about 2 weeks, I want to say. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, and would love to send more community voices, perspectives over for them to review and read through and reflect on as we look towards the upcoming session. And if you don't want to be involved in that, just privately message me or Joshua, and we'll remove that, but definitely please participate in the dialogue. And with that, I am going to go through a series of 4 questions, and we will have to take off the slides so that we can see everyone. And I will put the questions in the chat. So Joshua, if you can turn off the slides, so I can see everyone's beautiful faces. I encourage everyone to turn on their cameras if you're willing and able. It's okay if you're not, but if you are, please feel free to do so. And if someone could time keep, ideally we can keep the conversation to about like 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll close out tonight. So I'm gonna lean on Joshua to do that timekeeping. Oh, Josh, do you want to do the timekeep? It doesn't. We'll do Joshua. It's okay.
Yeah, happy to.
And can someone take some notes during this conversation? Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. Cool. Okay, so the first question, just wanting to start off pretty broad and then maybe narrow in a little bit from there, is what does clean water for all mean to you, for your family, and or for your community? So I'll start with that, and folks feel free to come off mute and share their thoughts for that question. Again, what does it mean? What does clean water for all mean for you, your family, and for your community?
Better health.
Better health. Thank you. I resonate with that as well. And if you resonate with something that someone's saying, feel free to do the clap reaction or the thumbs up or the heart reaction, any reaction to express that you resonate with what someone said. Cool. Better health. What else comes to mind when you think about clean water for all and what that may mean for you?
Kind of hard to break it down, huh? Well, life expectancy. Employment without a great deal of absenteeism.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Gabe said it's the bare minimum I expect from a functioning society. Literally same. Could not agree more.
With an emphasis on the word all, it means justice. It means everyone has the rights and the protection that they all deserve, regardless of class, race, and everything else.
Exactly.
I
agree.
I would also say it means that we have to be willing to make the dollar investment to get it.
100% agree.
And increasing education to, the connection between heavy metal poisoning and disease.
Thank you for sharing that. So I'm hearing better health, a human right that everyone should be afforded, that is actually now in our New York State Constitution, the right to clean water, climate. There's like 8, there's a whole sentence, right? Water, climate, and
Clean air, clean water, and a healthy
air. Thanks, Joshua. Yeah, so I almost got it confused with our organization's mission. Anyways, so yeah, I totally hear what people are saying. Better health, life expectancy, the bare minimum from a functioning society. And something that means to me as well is when I think about clean water for all, what comes to mind is like a reaction of trust and trusting our government, trusting what's coming out of our taps, not having to have it be a fear that I don't know what's in my water. Trusting that people are doing their jobs and people are investing in making sure. So with that, we can move on to the second question. And this one is along the same lines. And I'm wondering to see just like what might come to mind when people think about this. But if you're willing and able, I invite people to close their eyes and really imagine a lead-free New York. What does that image look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? Just as descriptive as possible. What comes to mind when you close your eyes and you envision a lead-free New York?
Fresh.
Fresh. That's perfect.
I see less plastic bottles.
That's real. Less plastic bottles, fresh. Something that comes to mind for me is I think about, obviously there's kind of this, clear relationship between lead exposure and success in schools and mental functioning. And when I think about a lead-free New York, I think of every kid just walking across their high school graduation or their college graduation and just being so extremely successful in their life and what they do. And that's something that comes to mind when I think about a lead-free New York.
Yeah, I see an impact on human behavior, period. I mean, if you honor the water, it means you have to also have a way in which you approach it. It's not just you're getting good from the water, it's how you take care of it and what you do with it. So I'd see it impacting human behavior in a positive way.
I 100% agree. And I really resonate with that, building a relationship with the water that comes out of your tap and where you get your water from and conserving it as well and kind of building that relationship with water.
And including in education in schools about how important it is and our connection to it and how we don't live without it. We don't live without Mother Earth and the water and everything she gives us.
Yeah, I 100% resonate with that. And again, if other folks resonate, you can say it verbally or use any of the reactions that are in the Zoom at the bottom bar.
Some water companies out of business, bottled water.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. And this can extend to, I really appreciate that you said that, because it's not just focusing on the pipes, it's focusing on the systems that contribute to water inequities and water injustices, which also include privatized water, which I know many folks on the call can resonate with and actively advocate against as well. So
Right.
Appreciate you. And oh, yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to number one. I think it all, what having clean water means. I think it also means the big corporations being willing to let go of being so greedy and hoarding so much money, greed and hoarding. And being willing to let go and do what's right for humanity and Mother Earth, and stop polluting her.
100% agree. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll move on to the third question. What do we need to do to ensure every New Yorker has access to lead-free, clean drinking water at an individual level, at a community level, and even above that at a societal level? Constructs that we need to kind of deconstruct or reconfiguring of some social norms, anything like that, anything that we can do at the individual level and in our communities to make sure everyone has access to clean drinking water and lead-free water.
For me, it's just to begin talking about it with people and just connecting them to the reality of what's going on, and education, helping people to become aware and wake up, because they don't learn a lot from the mainstream news. It's not really discussed, and so just finding ways to just bring it up wherever you are, wherever you're with. So increasing education in school.
Yep,
from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And educating everyone around us. I completely agree. That's a great first step for everyone to take at an individual level.
I think doing whatever we can before the end of this year, next week, and going into early next year, to try and influence as many people as we can to demand of our state representatives they put some money in the budget for 2022. No money, no addressing these issues. So we got to make people aware.
Exactly.
That's what we got to light the match.
Yeah, pressure on your representatives. Just keep calling them, and the power is in the people. You have to speak up, speak out, and then try and vote for what's right and best for whoever's going to, who you feel is honestly going to do what's right and best for our health.
Thank you. And I see that Gabrielle has her hand up if you want to unmute, or maybe not.
Yes, I almost feel like I'm being set up, Rob. Is Tamsin on? And I feel like community circles are in order. This is how the Newburgh Clean Water Project got started. We actually came together because of the PFAS. I don't know what all those PFAS stands for, but then we started talking about lead as well. So we've known that lead has been in our water for decades, but most community members, including myself, didn't know we could actually fight, or didn't have the time to fight. We were just taking care of our kids, going to work, so in survival mode like most people. So we just started buying bottled water. Like, here I am. and so then I started reading about how bad the plastic is for the ocean and even my own body. I'm like, okay, well, I have to drink water. And so we developed a series of circles called I Am Water. And part of that was to bring awareness to the lead. But first, we wanted to remind ourselves of our connection to water, because it's not just drinking it, we bathe in it. We cook in it. We cook with it. Not cook in it, we cook with it. So the conversation just began to grow and grow. And we also did Watershed Tours. Most of us are so far removed from the planet, not, for whatever reason, including myself. We're just in survival mode, taking care of our families, our elderly, whatever community work we can do, that sometimes water is one of those things that's just taken for granted. I just took for granted that people in those positions would have taken care of this by now, my dear friend that started this in 1994. I just took it for granted. And I think most people do. And now we're in the middle of a pandemic. People's focuses are totally somewhere else. So again, I'm thinking like, okay, what can I do in answering this question? What do we need to do for a lead-free New York? And it's Jerry Maguire, show me the money, baby. Nothing's going to happen without it. And so I have a few days left. I was with our assemblyman on Saturday, and we had a short conversation about it. So I know Tamsin's probably not on this call, but I think community circles are in order again, just to remind people, because you know how things go. It's a hot topic, and then it's not. And then we don't want to be back here again in 2045, starting from scratch. So thank you.
1,000%. And Rob wrote all that down, so it'll be submitted for in our comments. And I want to honor the time. It's 6:44. So thank you everyone for answering those questions. And I'll turn it over to Rob to close it out. And once Rob is done, if people have some time and they want to put in the chat anything else they'd like their elected officials to hear, please do. That was the last question. So once Rob is done wrapping up, if you want to hop off, feel free to pop whatever else you'd like to say in the chat before you go.
Yeah, thanks, Dharma. First, just wanted to say again how great it was to see all of you here, how happy we are that you came out to listen and learn and talk and discuss. Because it's these kind of events when we can all come together that starts to build that momentum towards solving these problems, to getting justice for communities, and to getting to a place where every single New Yorker has clean water, no matter where they live, no matter who they are. One thing is I think a lot about this issue that I wanted to raise at the end here is just the incredible opportunity we have right now in this moment to get to a lead-free New York. I don't think we have ever been at a spot as closer as we are now to eliminating every single lead pipe across New York State. Should make us really excited and really energized and ready to kind of act and mobilize and work with our neighbors to push this issue at a state level, at a federal level, and to make sure our decision makers follow through. So there's going to be a lot to do in the next year. The state legislature comes back in just a couple of weeks. And as folks have been mentioning on this call, there's going to be a need to push them in the budget, outside the budget, to enact the policies that's going to get us on that path towards 100% lead pipe replacement, towards eliminating all the other sources of lead exposure and lead poisoning. That's what it's going to take to get us to a lead-free New York. So excited to work with all of you on that push in this coming year. Really excited to stay in touch. As we mentioned earlier, recording of the event, the PowerPoint, will make it available to everybody in the next day or so. But with that, want to say thanks again. Hope you all have a great night and a great holiday. And we'll look forward to being in touch again soon.